In this lesson, we take a look at the motion blur. Let me walk you through the scene quickly. For this scene, I have this animated sphere, and as I play my timeline, you can see it has both rotation and position animation. Now, let's put the timeline to frame 14 and open up the render settings so we can access the motion blur settings. Now, if you click on Arnold Render section and under the main tab, you have motion blur section. In order to see motion blur for your animated object, the only thing you need to do is to check this enable option. And if I run my IPR, we start to get this very subtle motion blur. The first option is deformation. So if you have a deformer like Bend Deformer, for example, and you have animated it so the vertices are changing during time, you need to have deformation enabled so motion blur would take that deformation into account. We have camera, and if you have an animated camera in the scene and you want the motion of the camera to cause motion blur, you have to keep this option enabled, otherwise you can disable it. Before going through keys and position, let's see what length does. Length basically controls the amount of motion blur, so if you want to have longer motion blur trails, you need to increase this value. Let's set it to 2. And as you can see, we have a longer motion blur trail compared to the previous one when the length was 0.5. Let's increase the length to 3, and as you can see, we have even longer motion blur trail. Also up here you have this shutter angle, which as you increase the length, you are also increasing the shutter angle. So if I change the length to 0.5, shutter angle is 180 degrees. Change it to 1, shutter angle is 360 degrees, and so on. Let's set the length back to 3. Now if you take a look at the render and compare it to the movement of the sphere in the scene, you can tell that the motion blur trail doesn't follow the path of the sphere. And that is because the keys value is set to 2, which is a fairly low number for such a nonlinear motion. Keys here is the number of substeps used for motion blur. Right now we only have 2 substeps, and therefore we can't have any curved motion blur trails. Now let's increase the keys to something like 5. And as you can see now, the motion blur trail represents the motion of the sphere much better. We have these position controls, which allows you to control when the camera shutter opens and closes relative to the frame being rendered. By default, it is set to center on frame, so the shutter is open during the current frame. We are rendering frame 14, and the length of the motion blur is set to 3. So from 12.5 to 15.5 will be calculated. Let's change the position to start on frame. When it is set to start on frame, the shutter opens at the current frame. So because the length is set to 3, we are calculating from frame 14 to 17 this time. Remember, 14 is the current frame. Now let's change the position to end on frame. Now the shutter closes at the current frame. The current frame is 14, and we are calculating from 11 to 14. If I change the position mode to custom, we can manually define the start and the end point of the motion blur. So for example, if I wanted to get the same result like when the position mode was set to start on frame, considering the length was 3 back then, I would change start to 0 and end to 3, and we get the exact same result if I set the start to negative 1.5 and end to 1.5. We would have the same result as when we had the position mode to center on frame. And if I set the start to negative 3 and end to 0, the result would be like when we had the position set to end on frame, and you can manually choose any number you want. Let's set the position to center on frame again. Also, if you close this windows and select the camera and apply an Arnold parameters tag under the main tab, we have these shutter controls that can be used to make the motion blur range smaller. Custom shutter size, basically by default the shutter size defined in the Arnold render settings are used. This option here allows you to set up a smaller shutter size within the global range. And we have shutter start and end. The shutter range of the camera can be made smaller than the motion blur range exported from the scene by changing the shutter start and the shutter end parameters. This value is frame relative, which means 0 stands for the frame start and 1 is for the frame end. Right now the position mode is set to center on frame and the length is 3. Now if I enable custom shutter size and set the shutter start and end to -1 and 1, so we have the length of 2, we get a shorter motion blur trail. Let's disable custom shutter size for now. Down here you have shutter type, which is the type of filtering applied to time samples. We have box, which is normal filter that we have been using it. We have this triangle. Compared to the box, as you can see, the trail is tailored in a triangular way, and finally you can change it to curve and create your own filter. So let's add a few points here by control clicking. You can see this custom motion blur trail here. Also, if you want to control motion blur per object, for example, if you don't want a certain object to not have motion blur, simply apply an Arnold parameters tag, and under the motion blur tab you can enable or disable motion blur per object. So that is about motion blur. I will see you in the next lesson in which we talk about camera types. So see you there.